The Lord be with you. That is so effective in Presbyterian spaces. Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you back. I trust that everyone is sufficiently fed, nourished, caffeinated, hopefully, because we are in for a real treat, you all. And this is my honor to introduce our speaker for the afternoon. But before I get to the introduction, a word of instruction. There will be Q&A after the keynote. Now, how that's going to happen, raise your hand if you're on the Twitters. Okay, if you're on Twitter and your phone is charged, you can go to Twitter during Dr. De La Torre's keynote, pose a question with the hashtag NextChurch2020. All right? Amen? If you're not on Twitter, or if technology is just not your thing, then we invite you to jot down on a piece of paper, and there's some paper available here. Jot down on a piece of paper your questions, and they will be collected after the keynote. So 2 ways, either through Twitter, hashtag Next2020, or on paper, and we'll do it the old-fashioned way. So friends, once again, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for the afternoon, the Reverend Dr. Miguel de la Torre. So in the fall of 2005, 25 students of various ages, some of us were new grads, some of us were grandparents, and just about every stage of life in between, filed into a New Testament studies class at Howard University School of Divinity to sit at the feet of Dr. Kane Hope Felder. And over the next few weeks, we would all struggle to keep up with him as he effortlessly vacillated between English, Greek, Hebrew, German, Arabic, French, and back to English again, as he not so much poured out, but spilled out into us his wealth of knowledge. And you know, our tuition checks had barely even cleared yet, and we were just trying to keep up with him. Drinking from a fire hose would have been a lot easier. And keeping up with his reading list was just as demanding. But if you did, it was entirely worth it, because it included in that syllabus reading the Bible from the margins. By you, sir. And that would indeed forever change the way we would read the Bible. It was that text that made plain for me the connection between capitalism and John Calvin's theology, which for a person who was flirting with ministry in the Presbyterian Church USA was super mind-blowing. You weren't our instructor, but you were our teacher. And from then on, there was absolutely no way we could read the Bible through anything other than a liberative lens. Born in Cuba months before the Castro Revolution, Dr. De La Torre and his family came to the United States as refugees when he was just 6 months old. In his early 20s, he became a born-again Christian and joined University Baptist Church in Coral Gables, Florida. He later would leave a thriving real estate company to attend Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, in order to obtain his MDiv. He continued his theological training and obtained a doctorate from Temple University in social ethics. And the focus of his academic pursuit has always been ethics within contemporary US thought, specifically how religion affects race, class, and gender oppression. A scholar and activist, Dr. De La Torre specializes in applying a social scientific approach to Latinx religiosity within this country, liberation theologies in the Caribbean and Latin America, and postmodern, postcolonial social theory. He has authored several articles, and books, his latest being Burying White Privilege, Resurrecting a Badass Christianity, which takes a decidedly personal approach to the work his soul must have. Now, Dr. Felder is now gone. Dr. Cohn's now gone. Dr. Cannon's now gone. But thanks be to God, there are still teachers among us. So friends, let us give thanks to God and welcome very warmly the Reverend Dr. Miguel de la Torre.
Buenas tardes. Some 50 years ago, James Cone said that all white Christianity was satanic, and not much has changed. I would argue that all Eurocentric, enlightened, theological, and philosophical thought and movements are detrimental to communities of color. You see, when the French during the Revolution cried out, liberté, égalité, and fraternité, it was never meant for their colonized people in Vietnam, Haiti, or Algiers. You see, liberation was only for white French people. And in the very same way, Christianity, the way it is done in this country, is really only for white people. You see, as a child, in Blessed Sacrament in Queens, New York, every morning we would say the Pledge of Allegiance. And when I got to the line, and liberty and justice for all, even as a child, I knew that did not apply to me. So I guess what I'm trying to wrestle with is, how do you develop a white Christianity that excludes those who fall short of whiteness? And obviously, we could go into a long conversation, but basically, when a group of people universalizes their human experience based on their social location of whiteness, it delegitimizes all the philosophical and theological contributions that are made by those who are colonized and relegated to the underside of history. Now, before I go on, I'm going to bore you with a little bit of Hegel, just to make my point. And we're all familiar with Hegel's metaphysical historical dialectic, that history moves in an upward progression, that there's this construct of history where the synthesis and the thesis clash and creates a new antithesis, and it just keeps on moving in an upward manner. And in a very real way, for Hegel, history begins in the East and ends in the West, specifically in Central Europe, where he happened to be living, which becomes the apex of intellectual superiority. Africa, Asia, the American natives, Spain are all left out of history due to their inferiority. And the only way that they could ever enter history is when they come in contact with Europeans who are carrying the white man's burden of saving and civilizing them. Now, this idea of history, what we call salvation history, is not only a historical phenomenon, but it has become foundational even in our economics. Doesn't matter if you're a capitalist or a Marxist, both who are twins at modernity birth have a salvation history. In capitalism, we will continue the tide will continue to rise, lifting all the boats into some future utopia where everybody's going to be middle class, while in Marxism, we will wither away the state, and finally, we would also live in a utopia. So this idea of salvation history is part of our DNA. But you see, unfortunately, I drank the Foucault Kool-Aid. And for me, history has become nonlinear. That is, it is not connected. History is whatever I say history is, by particularly finding certain points in time, stitching them together so that I could give a narrative for today that justifies what I'm doing today, as well as justify what I'm going to do in the future. So when Martin Luther King, who I greatly honor, says that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, I would probably push back and say the arc of the moral universe could care less which way it bends. And because there is no history, it could bend towards justice as well as injustice. And if any bending is going to occur, we're the ones that have to do the bending. So, let's put this little history lesson aside for a moment, and we'll come back to it. But I wanted to lay that foundation before I went on. Before I begin to confront the oppression that's imposed by the dominant culture, I need to confront my own complicity with that oppression. I have to really deal with how much my mind has been colonized. So I'll give you an example. When I was around 19, 20 years old, hair down to about here, I had this really hot Ferrari. No, I'm sorry. I thought it was a Ferrari. It was really a Capri, but it was red. I made believe it was a Ferrari and drove it as though it was. But one day I drove from Miami, where I was living, to New York City for the weekend. And on my way up there, I got stopped in New Jersey for going 5 miles above the speed limit. And as the police officer pulled me over, he asked if he could search my car. And I said, yeah, sure, go right ahead. I mean, I've never argued with people that have guns. And I asked him, what are you looking for? And he goes, oh, well, this was back in the 70s. He says, we suspect that young Latino men driving red cars with Miami license plates are probably bringing cocaine to New York. And we're just trying to make sure that doesn't happen. They didn't find anything. But as I was driving away, and by the way, this is not the first time I was stopped for driving while under the influence of being Latino. As I was driving away, what went through my mind was not righteous indignation. Instead, what I thought to myself was, thank God the cops are doing their jobs and keeping us safe. You see, my mind was so colonized that I saw myself through the eyes of my oppressor. I defined my body the way the white police officer saw me. And I imposed upon myself my own discipline. So the very first thing we must do is we must learn to do our ethics, our history, our theology, not from those who profit from our marginalization, but through our own cultural symbols, through our own way of seeing. And the one concept I want to talk about today is the concept of hope and why we must reject it. Now, I read the brochure before I came here about Joshua 4:19, what these stones mean, witness, power, and hope. And as we know the story, in the banks of the Jordan, Joshua gathers the people and collects these stones to make a pile to be a witness of the power of God and the hope for the future. But what we forget about this story is what happens in chapter 6. After they invade Jericho, they put everything that has life to the sword, whether it be old or young, animal or human, male or female. You see, the hope is based on the hopelessness of those who are about to be genocide. So hope works very well when you are among the conquerors. But for those who are to be genocide, hope becomes somewhat problematic. Hope becomes a form of domestication. You see, it gives me this idea of spiritual liberation that somehow justify my physical domination. In believing in the riches of the hereafter while ignoring the oppression of the here and now. And when I embrace the hope of the dominant culture, I embrace my own oppression, and it makes God vomit. José Martí, my intellectual mentor, once said, "El vino de plátano y si sale agrio sigue siendo nuestro vino." For those of you who have yet to learn to speak the language of the angels, let me translate for you. We will make our wine out of plantains, and even if it comes out sour, it is still our wine. To see with my own eyes, to define my theology with my own cultural symbols requires me to make my wine out of the cultural symbols of my country, which is plantains. And it doesn't matter if it tastes bad, because it's mine. And because it's mine, it has worth and it has meaning. So if I want to reject the Eurocentric theological supremacy of the academy, I have to do my theology and my ethics and my biblical studies from my own cultural grassroots. And I know that there will be a lot from the dominant culture who would have a problem with this and will disagree and will want to push back. And I say this with the utmost respect. I really don't care, because this is not for you. I'm really speaking to the few faces of color in the audience. That's who my audience is. And the rest of you are fortunate to get to hear into my conversation to them. And you might get something out of it, or you might not, and it doesn't matter, because this is really for the marginalized of society. How do we begin to break away from a Eurocentric way of doing theology, which is enforced by the academy, that has contributed to our own oppression? You see, every time I quote Hegel, I am contributing to my oppression. And I'll get into that in a few moments. When I was working on my PhD, I had to memorize the works of Barth and Buttmann and Brunner and a whole bunch of other German names that begin with B. But I also had to be fluent, not only in the writings of Gonzalez and Isasi-Diaz, but also of Park and Lee, as well as Cohn and Cannon, as well as Tinker and others. In other words, I had to not only know the canon of the dominant culture, I also had to know the canon of marginalized communities. Yet my white colleagues at the theological school never had to read any of that stuff. And yet they were the ones considered intelligent and academically rigorous. So what I'm trying to do is reject the theological views of the dominant culture and try to stand in solidarity with the marginalized and learn how we can make our own wine out of our own cultural symbols. So, hopelessness, embracing hopelessness. This concept really came to me when I was taking a group of students to Cuernavaca, Mexico. And the reason I took the students there, we were trying to make a connection between the poverty that we were witnessing in the squatter villages to the neoliberal privileges we have in this country. And we were going basically to learn from the poor and the oppressed of the world. In the evening, we have to begin to unpack what we saw for most of our students. And I remember this one student said, I just saw the misery of these people. But when I looked into the eyes of the little girl, I saw the hope in her eye. And at that moment, I had an epistemological meltdown. Because what I realized, the hope she was claiming was nothing more than a middle-class privilege that excuses her from doing anything about the poverty of this little girl in Cuernavaca. All things do not always work for good for those who are called according to God's purposes. In Spanish, the word hope is esperanza. Esperanza comes from the word esperar, which means to wait. You see, when I use my own cultural symbols, I am very cognizant that my word for hope is also the word for wait. And we're not always sure what we're waiting for, and we're not always sure if the waiting is for something good or for something bad. I'm sure you've heard some preacher give the sermon in where they said something like, there was a big storm and the beach was full of starfishes, and there was a little girl in the beach throwing the starfishes back into the ocean. Is this familiar? And as they're throwing it back, there's a grumpy old man on the beach who says, you can't save them all. And she picks up one and says, I'll make a difference in this one, and throws it in. We all go, okay. I'm the grumpy old man on the beach. Because what I realize is that when we pick up one and place them on a pedestal and say, see, there's hope for this one, we can ignore the thousands of others who are rotting on the beach dead. I grew up in some of the worst barrios of New York, in slum areas that we only had one bathroom per tenement floor. A lot of my friends never made it out of the barrios. Some are 6 feet under before they even hit 20. You could definitely put me on a pedestal and say, look, he made it. See, there is hope. But I am very aware that I only made it out of mostly luck, and that the vast majority of my friends did not make it, and they were no worse or no better than I was. So my problem is that the stench of the rotting bodies have literally choked all hope out of my nostrils. So when people speak of hope, by celebrating the irreducible to the personal, it just becomes problematic for me. Now, of course, I have to mention Moltmann. And this is why I talked about Hegel earlier. See, for Moltmann, God exists outside of history. He has a process God that is learning. But we can trust God because God keeps God's promises. God made promises to us, and God will keep them. Tell that to Primo Levi, who was an Auschwitz survivor, who gave us the quote, "There is no God, only Auschwitz." God did not seem to have kept God's promise to the Jews. So if my hope is based on God keeping God's promises, and I look at Auschwitz, I have to rethink both this God and these promises. Now, Moltmann says, don't worry, at the end of history, we'll look back and everything will make sense. No matter how I look back, the Holocaust will never make sense. Slavery will never make sense. Gunboat diplomacy will never make sense. You ever notice the way Jesus appears in a tortilla every so often? There was a study done in Korea in where our minds are wired in such a way that when we look at chaotic images, our minds forces a pattern onto it, usually a face. So if I was to say, look at the chaotic image of the grooves on this podium, if you look hard enough, you'll probably see a face in it. In the same way, when we look at history, our minds are designed to see the face of Jesus in history in the same way we see the face of Jesus in a tortilla. We read God into history, and therefore we can say, oh, see, there is a plan. It's all going to work out. Therefore, I don't have to worry. But Ecclesiastes reminds us, vanity of vanities, absolute fertility, everything is meaningless. Boy, there's an uplifting message. So why am I so down on hope? I have chosen to stand in radical solidarity with the oppressed of the world who live in Holy Saturday. When I work on the border and I visit children in cages, they are living in Holy Saturday. And to tell them it's all going to work out, that all things work for good, is somewhat disingenuous of me. Because it's not all going to work out. And even when they leave those cages, the psychological damage will haunt them for the rest of their lives. So to stand in the Holy Saturday, not knowing if there even is a resurrection on Sunday, is to lose control of time and history and be in the moment of anxiety and not knowing. When I was writing the book, Embracing Hopelessness, one of my students, who was a member of a gang, got arrested and was sent back to prison. And with my permission, he took my manuscript with him. And he began to do a study among the other gang members who were in prison based on my manuscript. And they got it. They understood what I was talking about because they are among the most marginalized. And that's who my audience is. Those who understand the hopelessness and any visions of hope or too often appear but an illusion. Hope is successful in domesticating me. When I was in Auschwitz, they had that sign over the gate that said, "Work will set you free." It did not. You went through those gates, and more than likely, you were going to die. But if I had hope that work would set me free, maybe I would work hard, keep my head low, not make eye contact, and maybe I'll survive, even though I would not. You see, hope becomes a way of controlling people. Hope in losing the little that I have keeps me quiet and docile. But when I have no hope, when I realize I have nothing to lose, that's when I'm the most dangerous. That's where I'm trying to get my people to realize that by embracing hope, nothing will change because they're afraid of losing the little crumbs that they have. So I have to ask, where is God in all this? Well, if I read the biblical text clearly, sometimes God is simply absent. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? And I know we like to sometimes save God from God and try to give a theology that, no, basically Jesus is quoting a verse from one of the Psalms and bringing us back to that to show that he really is the Messiah. Yeah, no, I think Jesus truly felt forsaken on that cross and cried out in the midst of that hopelessness. And that's okay. Because if Jesus knows what it means to be forsaken, then he might be able to understand how my people feel today on the U.S. border. God sometimes appears somewhat sadistic. I mean, have you read Job? I mean, seriously, have you, here God is gambling with Satan, saying, I'll make you a bet. I bet you I can make Job curse you. Nah, you can't. Let's put something on it. I don't have any money, but let's just put everything that Job has on it. Kills all his children, takes away all his wealth, gives him horrible health issues. And for 50-plus chapters, we're trying to figure out what's going on here. And at the very end, what does God tell Job? Tough, I'm God. Who the hell are you to tell me what to do? That's not very satisfying to me. I find that somewhat problematic. And we could say, yeah, but God blessed Job with more riches and more, and better health and more children. But for anyone who has ever lost a child, it doesn't matter how many more you have, that loss is never gone. The damage has been done. And God seems to have a dark side. I mean, in Isaiah it says, if good or evil enter unto the city, is it not I, God, who bring it? God brings good and evil. Or God send evil spirits unto Saul. Think about that. I thought that was Satan's job. God sends evil spirits. Now, I'm not a theologian, although some of my best friends are. So I'm not going to try to explain this. I'm just one to raise the issue that this God is more complex than we make God out to be. And for those who have lived lives of oppression, even though they still love God and follow God, they realize that this is a complex God that does not neatly fit into all things work out neatly. So, lately I've been talking about this idea of creating a badass Christianity. And basically all that is how once we reject hope, how do we then act? So I want to talk a little bit about praxis. The hopelessness that I am advocating rejects quick and easy fixes. In other words, there are no simple solutions. And every solution brings its new levels of oppression. When I used to be in the business world, we would make a 5-year plan. We would look at what's going to, where the market's going to be 5 years from now, our resources today, and how do we get there. That doesn't work with spirituality and social justice issues, because neoliberalism is 10 steps ahead of us. They already know what we're going to be doing 5 years from now, and they have contingency plans, so that as we begin to take one step forward, we will be pushed back 2 or 3 steps. So the idea that somehow we are going to overcome the oppressive structures, it's not going to happen. It hasn't, nor will it. Racism, xenophobia, sexism, homophobia are with us for a long, long time. It is hopeless that we will overcome those forms of oppression. So if I recognize that, how then do I do ethics? Now, I am a social ethicist, so here's why this is important to me. How do I do ethics? Facing that reality. I want to begin with my understanding of God. And I already explained some of my concerns. Miguel de Unamuno was a philosopher of the early 1900s. I don't know if anybody ever read him. If you haven't, you should. He has this believable book called The Tragic Sense of Life, which you have to read sometime in your lifetime. He basically argues that you cannot prove there is a God. You just can't. And if you prove that there's a God, then that's not a God, if you could prove it. And by the same token, you cannot prove there is no God. There's no way you could prove either God exists or God doesn't exist. And because you can't prove it, it's better to believe, because that's more profitable than not believing. I love his pragmatism. And what he argues is that the issue for me is not to figure out who God is, what God is, and how I get to believe in this God. That's totally unimportant, which is really the foundation of Eurocentric theology and all the arguments that they have about who is God and what is God. Instead, what's important is, if there is a God that I say I believe in, how do I live my life accordingly? In other words, if I choose to believe, and that's why they call it faith, because faith you can't prove. If I choose to have faith, then how do I live my life? My objective is not to convince the non-believer to believe. My objective really becomes to convince the non-person of their personhood. How do I convince those who have been told that they lack personhood that they are indeed treasured, not by only God, but by this world and by humanity? So it really doesn't matter if there is a God. What's important is believing in the God that might exist, according to Unamuno. Which allows me not to seek answers that lead to correct doctrines as to why people are suffering, but rather I seek correct actions, correct praxis that I can employ, fully aware that the injustice that correct praxis may signal our demise. I try to tell my students, do you fight for justice because you think you're going to win? You see, once you think you're going to win, everyone jumps on the bandwagon. Okay. But is that why you're fighting for justice? Or do you fight for justice even when you know that the battle is already lost? Even though you know there is no way in hell you're going to win. Do you fight for justice because you're going to get an extra ruby in your crown when you get to heaven? What I'm hoping my students will walk away with is that they fight for justice because it defines their humanity and it defines their faith, regardless of the consequences. Iliff School of Theology is probably one of the most liberal, leftist theological schools in the country. And every so often I have my white students come up to me and say, "Oh, Dr. De La Torre, let's all go get arrested for such and such a thing." To which I usually respond, I'm a Latino. I don't have to go try to get arrested. It comes very natural, unfortunately. You guys go get arrested. But you see, they want to get arrested so they could get their liberal badges of fighting the fight. It becomes a rite of passage of how liberal they are because they got arrested. And don't get me wrong. There are times when one's action does lead to detention or arrest. But you do your best not to get detained or arrested. When I was in the border and I was detained by the Border Patrol, for a couple of hours, I talked them into not arresting us. Because if they did, all the money that's going to help the cause of the migrants would not have to be spent on my attorneys. So it does no one any good except give me some street cred, which I really could care less about. So how then do we do praxis in an age where protest has been domesticated? You realize we're the only country in the world that you could drive to a march. Think about that. There is a privilege in protest. I have to go to the police department to get a permit from the police department to protest the police department for police brutality. You see, I can protest as long as I follow the rules of the protest. Therefore, nothing is changed except I feel good about myself because I carried a sign in a protest march. How do we do praxis by not following those rules? Well, first of all, I have to realize neoliberalism has won. It's won. It's not going to change any time in my lifetime. It's going to be here for a long time. And even if it crashes, there'll be a new economic system that will be just as oppressive. So in that world where I've already lost the war, how do I continue to struggle without losing the will to fight? And now here's where I think Moltmann really got it wrong. He defines the opposite of hope as despair. Okay? The opposite of hope is not despair. Despair means that I roll up into a fetus position and gnash my teeth and do nothing. The opposite of hope, I would argue, is desperation. Because desperation propels me towards action. The reason people jump into a desert with a good chance of dying Every 4 days, 5 brown bodies perish in the desert. An unbelievable genocide going on in our borders that we totally ignore. The reason they take that chance is not out of despair, but desperation. If they stay, the children could die. If they leave, the children could die. They have no choice. It is that desperation that I'm trying to embrace. I also find that as long as I hold on to hope, I will burn out very quickly. I mean, how many people enter into either social work or nonprofits, and after a couple of years they give up because they just burn out? And that's very common. And the reason is because they have hope. They actually think they're going to change something. And nothing changes. And they can't handle that kind of failure and the fertility of continuously trying, and nothing changes. If anything, things are getting worse. I mean, I'm remembering back to just 7 years ago how quaint immigration policy was back then. At least, we were still putting people in prison, families and kids in prison, but at least they were in prison with their moms. They weren't separated. Things have gotten a lot worse. But see, I'm not quitting because I always knew I'm not the Savior. I'm not going to change this. And it's going to probably get a lot worse. But again, I'm not doing this because I think I'm going to win. I'm not. I'm doing this because I have no other choice. It defines who I am. Hopelessness prevents burnout. And in a very real way, privilege means you could walk away. Those who have privilege don't have to fight this fight. I don't have a choice. My people are suffering. I have to be in solidarity with them. Privilege means I could just write books about who knows what. It's King Solomon's left ear, the shape of it. And it's nice and it's intellectually stimulating, but it changes nothing. I have that privilege. Privilege means I don't have to do this. So, what becomes the ethical response? Like I said, I refuse to follow the rules because the rules were designed by the dominant culture specifically to maintain their power and privilege in our society. So to follow the rules is to, like I said, domesticate myself because the rules are designed to keep me and my people oppressed. When I was in Mexico, I met with a Chiapa rebel. And we were chatting. He told me the story that when the government tried to take away his land, he went to the bureaucrats and, tried to complain. And they looked up at him and says, you smelly Indian, get out of here. So he told me, I showed up the next day, and I had a bandana over my face, and I was carrying an AK-47, and they listened to me. We had an interesting conversation. We made some progress. There was something about not following the rules that might lead us towards something a little more just. Think of Jesus overturning the tables at the temple, creating chaos, creating a mess. Because out of that chaos and a mess, new opportunities might arise. So I've developed, I'll take this back. I gave wording to something that oppressed people have been doing for centuries. I call it an ethics para joder. Now, for those of you who do know Spanish, I apologize for my language. But you see, joder is a certain word that you never say in polite conversation. is similar to a certain four-letter word in English that begins with F and ends with K. And it is a word that kind of means to screw with. It's an ethics that screws with the structures. It's an ethics that attempts to play the trickster. Now, I got this by doing grassroots analysis, and I was looking specifically at the Young Lords. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Young Lords. They were a turf gang in New York City when I was growing up. And they became, the leaders got arrested, and when they were in jail, they started reading a lot of revolutionary works, and their consciousness was raised. And when they came out of jail, they began a social movement. So one of the things they did, they began in Chicago, but I'm more familiar with the New York chapter. In New York, what they did was, in the barrio, sanitation would come pick up garbage whenever they felt like it. There was no schedule. So they went ahead and they swept the streets, they cleaned up all the streets, they put all the garbage in bags, they set it on the corner, and they called the sanitation department and said, please come pick up the garbage. And of course, the sanitation department laughed at them and hung up. So they took all those garbage bags to 3rd Avenue, they built a 3 or 4 foot wall, and they set it on fire during rush hour traffic. That's jodiendo. That's screwing with the system. Cops came, beat them up, threw them in jail. But also the New York Times showed up and took pictures and did an expose on the sanitation department. And now they pick up garbage in El Barrio on Tuesdays and Fridays. You see, by screwing with the system, by holding those in authority to the rhetoric that they expound, change was able to occur. Not liberation, unfortunately, but at least something a little more just. They also went to one of the churches in the barrio, La Primera Iglesia Metodista, the First Methodist Church. And they went to the pastor and they asked the pastor, we'd like to go ahead and during the week have classes to raise the Latino pride. We want to go ahead and have a clothes closet for people who need clothes, a food drive. We want to go ahead and provide legal help for the people who might need it. And the pastor looked at them and said, you bunch of commies, get out of here. So they showed up next Sunday, and they picked up the pastor, and they threw him out of the church, and they nailed on the wall, on the doors of the church, in red letters, the People's Church. And for about 2 or 3 weeks, they did all those things. And the church was packed. Until the cops came, beat them up, threw them in jail, kicked them out. At which point, that church stopped being the People's Church. Again, what actions do we take to hold those who wear collars accountable to the rhetoric that they expound on Sundays? How radical must we get to actually become the People's Church? If what I'm, how can I say this? So, if some of you are not offended by everything I'm saying, then I'm doing something wrong. Because if everyone agrees with us, we're not doing Christianity. We're just basically having a nice social club. This message of Christ is truly radical. But if we're thinking about our retirement fund, instead of being run out of town for what we say, maybe our emphasis is in the wrong place. This idea of overturning tables, of the young lords, like I said, it's not something new. The African American community had its Bear Rabbit and Bear Bear and stories of the trickster. The indigenous communities has Coyote and Spider and stories of their tricksters. In the Latinx community, we have Pepito and we have Juan Bobo, our tricksters. But in my particular community, and this is where this idea of an ethics of jodiendo really comes from, is el egua. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with those of us who come from the Caribbean, el egua is an African deity that the slaves brought to the Caribbean, and many people began to follow and practice these Yoruba traditions. In Haiti, it became known as voodoo. In Brazil, as Conumbre. In my country, Cuba, it became known as Santeria. So as one who grew up in Santeria, I found out I am a child of El Egua, who is the trickster, which means if you ever read anything I write, there is always a trickster element to it. It's part of this. And again, if I go back to Mati, if I'm going to make the wine out of our own cultural symbol, my cultural symbol is El Egua. And the idea of the trickster is that when the oppressed have no way of claiming any form of liberation, if you could upset those tables in the temple, maybe a new opportunity might arise that never could be seen until those tables were overturned. Or you may end up getting crucified. Not all things work for good. It could go either way. Either new opportunities may arise, or death may come. And that's what the trickster does. And I really believe that one of the problems of Eurocentric Christianity is that they beat the trickster out of their faith tradition. Because if you read the Bible, you have all kinds of tricksters there. I mean, what was it? Jacob didn't know that he was getting a different woman on his marriage day when he went to bed with her? Really? He didn't know? He ended up getting two now because he didn't know, Or Laban was really trying to trick him by changing wives on him? I mean, who was tricking who here? Seriously. Or Tamar, who plays the prostitute to hold Judah accountable to do what he was supposed to do? And David playing the crazy man so that, he doesn't get killed. So the Bible is full of tricksters, of people, of screwers, of joderones. I would say Jesus was probably the greatest joderón of all. I mean, think about it. People would try to trap him, and he would, give them these parables that just twist things around, and they didn't know what to do. And even Satan is not really the embodiment of evil, but more of a trickster. I mean, think about the temptations in the devil. In the desert. Make these stones into bread, the temptation of power. Of possession. Bow down before me, power, and jump off the temple, privilege. Those are the temptations that tricksters give. So, I guess the ethics that I am advocating in a hopeless situation where we're not going to win is how do I learn how to lie so I can discover what is true? How do I ethically cheat so that the poor could get their their equal share? How do I ethically steal so people can eat? How do I joke so as to disrupt? How do I deceive so as to reveal truth? That's really, I think, what ethics is all about, which makes this a more complex conversation, to say the least. So, in closing, how do we ethically screw with the structures of power and privilege and whiteness so that we can move a step closer to liberation. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. I think that you helped generate a kind of holy discomfort that was really necessary for all of us in here. And so I give thanks to God for how I feel right now, which isn't great. And that's okay. We'll survive that. And so there have been some questions submitted. I want to start off with one of my own to give you an opportunity, if there are some that are bubbling up for you, if you still want to get them in, great. You have a little time to do that. So what you would have to do is write out your questions on a piece of paper, and then you can raise them up, and Usher can come around to collect them from you. And with whatever time we have left, we will get to them as time permits. But as I'm listening to you speak about Erewa, I'm thinking about his counterpart, Oya, the Orisha of winds and change. So the trickster and the winds of change, and how we disabuse trickstery, I'm making up a word, from our faith tradition. Can you talk about decency and order to a group that is mostly Presbyterian? Yeah. And how we might be able to invite in a little bit of Eregua and Oya and all them.
Yeah, wow. Yes, right. You're all Presbyterians. You know, every time I'm involved in an organization and we need somebody to be the secretary and keep records, we always find a Presbyterian to do that because they, and unfortunately, it's usually my buddy, Ed Amponte, who ends up doing that because he's very good at keeping, so you guys are great at that. Yeah, lose that. I mean, it's great if you want to have order and have and you know, there's a time and a place for order, by all means, if you want to have that's good. But if you want to change the world and turn it upside down, it doesn't happen on a 5-year plan. It doesn't occur by making sure everyone and everything is in its proper place. Life not only is messy, but oppression makes it even more messy. And there needs to be a certain disorder. So basically, yeah, I guess I'm preaching chaos and disorder as the only way that the oppressed can find a way to maybe bring about change. Now, I'm not sure if that works with the dominant culture, but it's what we who are on the margins must embrace, because as long as we do follow order and we're just contributing to our own oppression. Yeah.
This sibling writes, I see a generational rise of hopelessness in white culture. Are there similar generational differences in sense of hope in communities of color?
Yeah, I think that is right. I mean, I can't speak for white cultures, but I do seem to be picking up that a lot of the younger generation of white people are also, you know, experiencing hopelessness. And part of it is because we've been a nation that always had white affirmative action, that there was always a place for white people to get a job, to get into the right school, and to have all the privileges. And that is being stripped away, especially since the 1960s, as communities of color began to hold the dominant white culture accountable to the rhetoric of liberty and justice for all, which is probably might explain the Trump white lash of trying to hold on to going back and make America great again, that is, going back to the privileges that it once had if you were white. But as the demographics are changing, as the dominant white culture itself is becoming oppressive by funneling the vast majority of the wealth to just the 1%, so that the middle class is losing the privileges they once had, which adds to what my doctoral professor Jim Reagan would always say, and that is we like to dream upward but blame downward. That is that we want to be a part of 1%, so we don't blame them. Instead, we blame those Mexicans who are coming over to take our job. So as all that is going on, and it's not working, and white young kids today are graduating with debts that are going to crush them for the rest of their lives, who can't get a job, who must live in the basement of their parents because there's no housing anywhere in the country where if you make minimum wage you could afford to live. As all those things are happening, yes, they are also embracing the hopelessness. And maybe the good news is they have more in common with communities of color than they do with those within their own skinfolk group. And maybe, there's some space there for making allies, across racial bounds and working together. But to do that, they have to really stop worshiping their white Jesus and start worshiping Jesus instead, or the black Jesus, or any Jesus that is of the marginalized groups.
It occurs to me that inherent in that question is the assumption that desperation hasn't always been a part of the experience of communities of color, of people of color groups, and it really has, as you alluded to in your keynote. Yeah. Orson Shire says you don't, and I'm paraphrasing her, you don't put your baby in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and you're right. And it doesn't matter how much economic privilege one may have. I'll be honest with you, I am more afraid now, living in this country for some 60 years, than I ever was growing up in this country. I mean, when I visit like a city like this that I have no idea where I am and what my neighborhood, I don't go out at night. I'm afraid because of all Latinos are undocumented until proven otherwise and face possible violence. So yeah, there's always been that desperation that for communities of color, money is not the answer.
All right, so this one. If the greatest of these that Christians were given were faith, hope, and love, then what is the point of saying we're Christian if hopelessness is the only way we can choose to survive?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think Paul might have gotten some things wrong. And I say that with all due respect. The stuff about women obey your husbands and the stuff about sending the slave back to the master, I think those were probably a few mistakes. And while this sounds beautiful, this particular verse, I love it also, there's a certain privilege, like I mentioned, in holding on to hope. I'm not saying give hope up. I'm saying recognize that for the vast majority of us, we don't have hope. I'm not, and I'll give you an example. I was in the desert once, and I came across this individual who was crossing the desert, and he saw me, and he said, "Oh, praise the Virgin Mary." I mean, I dropped my water jug. I had no water, and the Virgin appeared to me, and she led me to you. And I said, and at that point I could have gone and have a conversation. Well, you realize that, the Virgin Mary wasn't around when, 5 out of every 4 days people die in the desert. Why was the Virgin appearing to you and not them? Why are you so chosen and not them? I didn't go into that conversation. Instead, I said, "Oh, praise the Virgin. Yay, here's some water." So don't get me wrong. My job is not to take away people's hope. If you have it, all power to you. But realize that for the vast majority of those on the underside of your history, hope is a privilege that many of us can't afford to have. If hope is what defines your Christianity, yay. Hopelessness is what defines my Christianity. And I will do my Christianity using my own symbols.
You inadvertently answered a lot of the questions in this pile. Well, I think in your keynote really does stir up something that has us questioning the role then of hope in our faith, in our faith tradition. And I hear you clearly saying you don't have to give it up. Yeah. But there is another way, as Paul would say, yes. Right? Maybe more excellent, maybe not. So how does resurrection play into your theology? And what of all the Black and brown people who have made a huge impact and change precisely because of hope? Yeah. What of those?
I'm realizing that what I am articulating is something that, while has been part of all our cultures from the margins for a long, long, long time, hasn't really been articulated in this way. So I do expect a lot of pushback, even from my own communities, and I have received it, obviously. But I want to argue that a lot of the movements for justice probably was motivated by the realization that we're going to be killed anyway, so what do we have to lose?
So more desperation. More
desperation. And it's not so much the hope of the future, it's more the desperation of the now. So I am changing a little bit of the conversation, or not changing it, I'm emphasizing a different aspect of social movements. The desperation of the now over against some hope in the future. I was reading a critique somebody wrote on my book on hopelessness, and they listed like 3 people of color who based their whole thinking on hope. And I go, well, that's great. They wrote that like 20 years ago. If they would have read what I just wrote, maybe we would have had a conversation that might move our conversation. So the issue is not so much what others have said in the past. I think the issue is how will they be reacting to what's being said now. And I guess, based on people I've talked to, that there's something that resonates within the soul of the oppressed with what I'm saying, even if they may disagree with me. And that's okay. Like I said, I'm just, I have no desire to impose my views on everyone else, kind of like the way the Academy does it to people of color. I'm just presenting that for a large group of people who are not in church, who see no reason to go to church, who are totally hopeless, I'm trying to provide a message that it's okay. And I'm trying to basically provide a message that rather than channeling that hopelessness into destructive actions, how can we channel it into revolutionary actions that could bring about change? So like I said in the beginning, this message is not really for this group. It's really for those who are on the margins of the margins. That's who I'm really trying to have a conversation with.
This is a 2-part question. Who is someone in your life who has demonstrated or modeled for you that this work is worthwhile? And what brings you joy even in the midst of a quote-unquote losing landscape?
Okay. So I mentioned the Young Lords. They were very influential in my embracing of the hopelessness, mostly because of the praxis that they engage. So that's one group. Probably one of the people who really influenced my thinking a lot is Jose Marti, who I quoted earlier. And I just finished a book that University of Vanderbilt Press is going to be coming out with on my views on him. And the second question was,
what brings you joy?
What brings me joy? I don't know. I'm a joyful person. I know it sounds but you see, once I have taken off my shoulders the responsibility of fixing the world, once I don't have to be the one that saves everybody, once I don't have to provide the answer to every single oppression that exists, I could sleep a lot more at peace, because I could rest assured that I am doing everything I can in the midst of the hopelessness to try to bring about some change. And even if change doesn't happen, I'm okay with it. You know.
There are a few questions in this collection about the responsibility of white Christians. Some ask about individual responsibility, some ask about community responsibility, but there are a number of people who would like to hear more about the responsibility of white Christians to remain tied to the desperation of oppressed communities.
I would say that the most important thing white Christians can do is get saved. And what I mean by that is you really have to reject white Christianity. You have to reject this white Jesus. Because not only is it oppressive to communities of color, it also oppresses you. Not only does this white Jesus steals our humanity. Oh, I'm sorry. Not only does this white Jesus prevent us from being human, but it also steals your own humanity. This white Jesus is deadly for your community as well. So when I say you need to get saved, I really mean you need to start following the black Jesus, Jesus, the Asian American Jesus, the indigenous Jesus, the Jesus of the oppressed communities. You need to read those books. You need to study. And then you need to join us not to fix the problem, not to lead us, but to just be present until we say what we need. It's a very humbling position I'm asking, especially when when the dominant culture is so used to being the apex of intellectual thought, as per Hegel. I'm asking you to crucify your whiteness so that you can be born again and be a new creature in Christ, which is not easy to do. In the same way, I have to ask myself that I need to crucify my maleness and nail my sexism and my homophobia to the cross as well. We all have to crucify those parts of us that privileges us. But you know, so yeah, number one, get saved. And number two, you know, don't cry. And what I mean by that is, you know, every so often when I teach my class, somebody starts crying because of they're overwhelmed by the guilt or whatever, and that's nice. Leave the room. Leave the room, you know, compose yourself, come back, because it's not about you. It really isn't. And the second somebody starts crying and it's about them and, oh, I didn't know I was so bad, it takes the focus off of where the focus needs to be, those who are the ones who are being oppressed. So those are just some things that come to mind.
So to come back to communities of color and playing off of Marty's analogy of the plantain wine, why do we still call the plantain wine bad?
Well, number one, it will come out very sour. I'm just saying, if he would have said Cuban rum, no problem there. But he said, I don't know why he said wine. No, but taste-wise, but what it symbolizes is probably, it tastes so much better than anything that could come from the vineyards of France.
I think even taste-wise, though.
Really?
could our taste buds, our tastes, as
I
it
see
were,
what
be
you're saying.
colonized too?
Yeah.
I could think of haggis, for instance.
Yeah.
Not my cup of tea. Sorry, Scotch-Irish descendants. Not my cup of tea.
Yeah, no, I haven't gotten used to those mayonnaise cucumber sandwiches either. But
Well, and
I'll hold on to my rum, I'll tell you that.
but even for communities
Yeah.
of color, what does it mean to decolonize? What is the work that we need to keep pushing to do so that we don't recreate systems of oppression in blackface or brownface?
Yeah. No, and you're right. To say that I'm trying to decolonize my mind sounds like a simple task. I'm nowhere close to have really, I still write in English, so I could write in Spanish. Yeah, that's the colonizer's language also. So what do I do? It's part of my very being, how I have been taught to see myself and how I define myself, and even how I do scholarship, how I write books. It's all impacted. So yes, I will die still being very colonized in my mind. I know that. I could say I'm a recovering colonized person. That is, I fall off the wagon all too often. So there needs to also be grace there with myself when I fall off the wagon. That's the damage that this whole imposition of white Christianity has done. It goes back generations. And even my children are still going to be wrestling with this as well. So no, this is a process that sounds easy, but no, it's a lifelong challenge and the hopelessness of never truly be liberated from that colonized mind.
Well, I certainly think that if there are no others, I think that you may have pushed us to resurrect that badass Christianity that we could better live into. And so, gracias. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
What a rich kickoff to this day and this week. We're going to need a break, I think, to reground ourselves. So we are about to take a break before workshops start at 4, and we want to particularly thank Presbyterian Publishing for sponsoring the break this afternoon. There are many, many, many sponsors who help make this national gathering possible, and we could not do it without their support. So we are thankful to them. You'll see many of their logos flashing up on the screens this week and in the app. Please do take time to read through those organizations so that you do know who to thank for being able to be here this week. And I want to particularly mention the Presbyterian Foundation this afternoon. They sponsored the remaining 2 preachers that you'll hear this week, Flo Barbie Watkins and Brian Blunt. They've made it possible for us to get them here and be part of this week. So we are grateful to them for that. Please do take a moment during the break to find the bookstore. It's on the far end of the exhibit hall if you haven't seen it yet. You can pick up books from many of the presenters you'll hear this week, including Dr. de la Torre. So I know many of us will want to go read more about your work and your theology after this very thought-provoking time this afternoon. Please also keep in mind some of the things coming up tonight. There is a happy hour for Presbyterian Youth Workers Association, so join that if you are interested. There are still tickets available for the Flint screening tonight, so join Denise and others for that. And if you are grateful, as I am, for all of this conference and all of the connections and all of the provocation and invitation to deepening your own spirituality, your own work in ministry, I would invite you to take out whatever device you have with you and go to the Next Church website, nextchurch.net, and donate to the work that we do with Next Church, because we really cannot, we are a grassroots movement, and we cannot do this work without each and every one of you helping to make it possible. So thank you for being here, and please take time to help continue this work going forward. Enjoy the break, and go to workshops starting at 4. We'll see you later.